Picture the two most destructive forces in the galaxy, slamming into each other at full speed, each one a relentless war machine with no off switch. On one side, an Ork Waaagh, a howling green avalanche, driven by endless brutality and crude, joyful slaughter. On the other, the Tyranid Hive Mind, a cosmic apex predator of bottomless hunger and utterly alien cunning. Now imagine them locked together, their clash so ferocious that whole star systems go up in flames just from the shock waves of their war. This isn't some nightmare scenario scribbled in the margin notes of a panicked imperial savant. It actually happened, and the campaign that followed almost beggars belief. This is the saga of the Octarius War, a catastrophic confrontation born from one desperate idea. It all started with an Inquisitor's insane-sounding gambit. Hurl a Tyranid invasion right into the heart of one of the biggest Ork empires in the galaxy, and let the monsters rip each other to pieces. What could possibly go wrong was the unspoken hope. As it turns out, almost everything. The result was a war so apocalyptic that it threatens to spill beyond its borders and consume the galaxy in an even greater nightmare. In this monologue, we'll dive into the full saga of the Octarius War, how it started, the carnage that ensued, and what happens when an unstoppable war meets an immovable hive fleet. Buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. The Ork Empire of Octarius. Before disaster struck, the Octarius sector was essentially an Ork paradise. It was the domain of the Ork Empire of Octarius, ruled by a warlord known as the Overfiend. This was one of the largest and most ferocious Ork dominions in the galaxy, a realm spanning dozens of star systems, each teeming with green-skinned hordes. Imperial tacticians estimated that billions of Orks lived under the Overfiend's rule. Not that Orks do much living under rules. They spent most of their time scrapping and roaming as they pleased. It was a kingdom of constant brawling and conquering, where the Greenkins fought anything they could find. And when they ran out of enemies, they cheerfully fought each other. The Overfiend of Octarius, an Ork boss aptly described as exceptionally brutal even by Ork standards, sat at the top of this green pyramid of violence under his command. Countless Ork warriors, gargantuan war machines and ramshackle spacecraft were always on standby for the next big wow. The Orks' favorite word for both a crusade and the collective psychic zeal that drives them. For years, the Orks of Octarius had been relatively content smashing nearby aliens and squabbling among themselves. Little did they know fate was about to deliver the biggest brawl they'd ever seen, one that would put even their wildest battle fantasies to shame. The Great Devourer approaches. Meanwhile, in the late 41st millennium, another threat was devouring its way across the stars. The Tyranids. The largest Tyranid invasion yet, known as Hive Fleet Leviathan, had descended upon the galaxy from below, like a swarm of locusts coming up under the galactic plane. Leviathan was the mightiest manifestation of the Tyranid Hive Mind's hunger yet seen. A multi-pronged invasion striking from unexpected directions. The Hive Fleet infamously approached from beneath the galactic plane, a pincer from below that caught many defenders off guard. This swarm split into tendrils that consumed world after world on the galactic fringe with terrifying speed. Every planet it hit was stripped of life, forests reduced to barren dust, oceans drained, populations digested into biomass for the Hive Fleet's ever-growing swarms. The Imperium of Man was in a state of panic, fighting desperately to slow Leviathan's advance. Entire armies were being overrun and whole systems cut off. It became painfully clear that traditional defenses were barely making a dent. As Hive Fleet Leviathan rampaged throughout the southern regions of the galaxy, one man decided to try something drastic and unorthodox to stop it. Inquisitor Kryptman's gamble. Inquisitor Kryptman of the Order Xenos was a veteran alien hunter and perhaps the foremost expert on the Tyranid menace. He had already confronted previous Tyranid invasions, the earlier Tyranid Wars. and knew just how dire the situation was. As Leviathan tore through world after world, Kryptman resorted to measures as extreme as the threat itself. In a move that horrified even his Inquisition colleagues, he ordered exterminators on a string of Imperial planets directly in the path of the Tyranids. Billions of human lives were sacrificed, their worlds reduced to lifeless husks by virus bombs and cyclonic torpedoes. This policy would not go unpunished. His inquisitorial peers would later strip Kryptman of rank and declare him a renegade for these actions. But at the time, he deemed it a necessary evil. The idea was to rob the Tyranids of fresh biomass to consume, hoping to slow the Hive Fleet's growth. It worked somewhat, but at a cost so awful that Kryptman's superiors in the Inquisition could barely stomach it. Still, the Hive Fleet kept coming, perhaps hungrier than ever. Kryptman needed a new plan, something even bolder and arguably more insane than mass genocide. At one point during Leviathan's ravenous advance, Kryptman received reports and later personally reviewed picked feeds of a curious engagement out on the eastern fringe. A Tyranid splinter fleet had collided with a roaming Ork Waaagh on a backwater agri world. The resulting battle was beyond vicious. Jungles burned, the sky turned black with spores and smoke, and when the dust settled, the tyranny swarm did emerge victorious, but only after both sides had gutted each other. Mountains of orc dead and bio creatures littered the plains. The Hive Fleet had to halt for a time to replenish after what should have been a quick conquest. This grisly stalemate in microcosm set Kryptman's mind ablaze with a daring idea. Orks and Tyranids, two of humanity's fiercest enemies, might just ruin each other if thrown into a cage together. The Orks would get the monumental fight they always craved, and the Tyranids would get a glut of biomatter to keep them busy. Perhaps Kryptman theorized they might even annihilate each other, or at least weaken one another enough for the Imperium to handle afterward. It was a gambit as wild as it sounded. Lure Hive Fleet Leviathan into the heart of the Ork Empire of Octarius, and let nature take its brutal course. To put his plan into motion, Kryptman turned to deception, and to the deadliest bait he could imagine. First, he needed the Tyranids to follow a trail straight into Octarius space. Using kill teams from the elite, Xenos hunting space marines of the Death Watch, Kryptman struck at a Tyranid vanguard organism, Genstealers. On the mining world of Carpathia, Death Watch strike teams descended into the Stygian caverns, their bootsteps echoing through dripping dark. Down in those lightless tunnels they fought their way into a nest of Genstealers in savage close-quarters combat. Claws flashed in the gloom. Bolter fire lit jagged rock. Blood, human and alien, splattered the cavern walls. Veteran Marines died in those ambushes, torn apart despite their formidable war gear and experience. But in the end, Kryptman's gamble paid off. The surviving Death Watch managed to subdue and capture several live Genstealers, pinning them in stasis fields even as the creatures hissed and clawed at their invisible prisons, and hauled them back to the surface at terrible cost. These captured Genstealers, vicious, four-armed Tyranid infiltrators, designed to seep into societies and corrupt them from within, were locked in stasis and loaded aboard an ancient space hulk that had recently drifted from the warp. The derelict, a fused mass of ruined vessels and wreckage, was known as Perdition's Flame, and it just so happened to be tumbling through space on a course that would intersect the path of Hive Fleet Leviathan. Kryptman then pulled off another outrageous maneuver. He destroyed a minor celestial body, some records name it as the Moon Gist, using colossal demolition charges, the explosion nudging Perdition's Flame onto an exact trajectory of his choosing. It was a move equal parts brilliance and lunacy. No Imperial manual recommends blow up a moon to adjust course, but it worked. The Hulk, now carrying its hidden cargo of dormant Genstealers, drifted straight into the tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan. Like a baited hook, the Tyranids took it. When Perdition's Flame crossed Leviathan's path, The Genestealers aboard were released from stasis and began prowling the labyrinthine corridors, drawn by the psychic scent of prey and fresh genetic material. The Hive Fleet closed in. What it did not know was that this infested hulk was on a collision course with the Octarius sector. Kryptman had essentially packed a delicious appetizer for the Hive Mind and hurled it right toward the Ork's front porch. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, tricking one alien horror into crashing headfirst into another. The Genestealer trap is sprung. The trap was set, and it didn't take long before it snapped shut. As Perdition's flame drifted into Ork-held Octarius space, it was inevitably spotted by the ever-curious greenskins. Orks love nothing more than looting derelicts and scrap, especially titanic space wrecks that might be stuffed with guns, engines, or something interesting to smash. A mob of Ork looters simply couldn't resist. They boarded the hulk, eager to strip it of anything not bolted down, and most things that were. They expected rusted metal and dead ships. Instead, they found a nightmare waiting in the dark. Kryptman's caged Genestealers struck, ambushing the unsuspecting Ork scavengers deep within the twisting passageways of the hulk. The boarding party was butchered in savage melee. Those not killed outright were subjected to something arguably worse. The surviving Orks were blessed with Genestealer infection, implanted to gestate hybrid offspring carrying Tyranid genetic taint. Unaware, these infected Orks became living vectors. When they eventually limped back to their ramshackle ships and returned to their worlds, they carried with them the deadliest stowaways imaginable. The Genestealer curse began to spread throughout the Octarius Empire. World by world, Ork-held planets erupted into sudden grisly uprisings. Once loyal boys turned feral and cunning, guided by the psychic will of the brood mind. These Genestealer corrupted Orks sowed havoc from within, striking their own kind in coordinated cultist assaults. At first, most Orks were merely confused and irritated. Some of their mates were growing extra arms, acting sneaky, and skulking in a most un-Orky fashion. But confusion soon turned into full-blown civil war on several worlds as the Greenskins tried to purge the imposters in their midst. The outbreak might have escalated beyond control, but Orks are nothing if not brutally straightforward. They responded in the only way they truly understand: more violence. Several war bosses of the Octarius Empire temporarily put aside their usual turf squabbles to deal with this strange new infestation. They even hired the infamous Stormboy commando boss Zagstruck and his elite Vulture squad to root out the Genestealer hybrids. Zagstruck, a scarred Ork legend famed for dropping from the sky with rocket-powered boots to boot stomp heads into paste, eagerly accepted. His Vulture squad became Xenos killers, dive-bombing infected strongholds and literally stomping the cults back into the dirt. After a series of brutal tunnel fights in fungus-choked warrens and underhive nests, the Orks managed to crush the immediate Genestealer problem. If the story had ended there, the Octarius Empire might have finally exhaled in relief. But this was only the opening act. As much as Orks ever worry about anything, however, by destroying the Genestealers, the Orks had only cleaned up the crumbs. The dinner guest, Hive Fleet Leviathan, was already on its way, drawn to the psychic scent of the Genestealer brood, like a great beast sniffing blood in the water. Hive Fleet Leviathan descends, guided by that psychic beacon and Kryptman's deliberate monitions. A tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan veered off its course and plunged toward the Octarius sector. Soon the skies above Ork-held worlds began to darken with ominous shapes. At first, it was subtle, strange meteor showers and streaks of light across the void. But then came the living shadow, swarms of mycetic spores blotting out suns as they descended through atmospheres. These organic drop pods carried the first waves of Tyranid creatures to the surfaces below. The invasion of Octarius had begun. One of the first targets was a beleaguered Ork world called Orrok. The greenkins of Orrok were caught off guard when millions of fleshy spore capsules hissed down from the sky like a sick parody of a rainstorm. The Orks watched in bewilderment as daylight dimmed under the sheer number of incoming Tyranid pods. But Orks are nothing if not quick to exploit a good fight. Within moments, war horns were sounded. More accurately, great beastly roars and the clang of gongs made from scrap. Ork warriors rushed to man rusted fortifications and hop into guttural war machines. They had barely taken up positions when the spores smashed into the ground, bursting open to unleash swarms of clawed horrors. The battle for Orrok was immediate and intense. Tyranid creatures known as gaunts, small seeth-a-limb beasts acting as the Hive Mind's cannon fodder, charged in chittering waves. They crashed against the Ork defenses, and the Orks, overjoyed to have something to crump, countercharged with their trademark ferocity. The two forces met in a riot of violence. Thousands died within the first seconds of contact, ripped apart by claws, chopped apart by axes, perforated by bullets and spines. Every species of monster the Tyranids deployed found an eager, if brutally simple, opponent in the Ork squads of Ork boys. The basic greenskin fighters barreled into packs of hormagaunts in gory melees. Hulking Ork knobs, bigger, meaner bosses swung giant chain axes into towering Tyranid warriors and tank-sized carnifexes. Even as those bio-beasts rent Orks limb from limb with crushing claws. Massive Ork-trained beasts called squigoths. Imagine elephant-sized angry reptiles thundered across the battlefield only to smash headlong into Tyranid bio-titans. Enormous kaiju-like organisms that shook the ground with each step. The firefights were just as fierce. Ork machine guns and energy weapons blazing away at charging Tyranids, while the aliens spat globs of acid or sprayed barges of living spines in return. This war was not confined to one scale. It raged on every level from the colossal to the microscopic. Under the feet of battling giants, tiny but deadly Ork insects, the ever-present squigs and critters of an Ork ecosystem, were locked in their own fight for survival against swarms of Tyranid rippers and microbial Tyranid organisms. Tyranid phagy cells sought to consume and break down Ork fungus and spores in the very soil, while Ork fungal growth fought back by spreading even faster. Orks, after all, reproduce via hardy spores. It was as if the planet of Orrok itself screamed in conflict down to its tiniest organisms. In the skies overhead, Ork fighter-bomber aircraft dueled with shrieking Tyranid gargoyles and winged harpies. In orbit, Jurigged Ork spacecraft rammed into bloated Tyranid biohips, resulting in spectacular mutual annihilation that rained fiery debris on the lands below. Despite the Orks' love of battle and their prodigious toughness, the numbers were against them on Orrok. The Tyranid assault was unrelenting and utterly without fear. By the time night fell on the blood-soaked fields of Orrok, the green tide had been stemmed in most places. The Orks, still fighting in isolated pockets, gradually realized, to their reluctant dismay, that they were completely surrounded. For every Tyranid bioform they smashed, two more seemed to skitter forward from the darkness. Ammunition ran low. Even the most war-crazed Orks can only swing an axe so many times before their arms tire. By the battle's end, Ork was engulfed in carnage and then eerily silent. Not a single Ork was left alive on that world. All the victorious Tyranids wasted no time, beginning the gruesome work of harvesting every corpse and every scrap of organic matter for biomass. Ork, one of the first Ork bastions to face Leviathan's invasion, had fallen. Octarius under siege, when news of the disaster at Ork, such as it was mostly garbled reports of big bug attack. Lots of dead boys reached the Overfiend of Octarius. He reacted not with fear, but with something like excitement. Here at last was an enemy that could challenge the Ork Empire on a grand scale. The Overfiend, often named War Boss Blacktorf in Imperial records, was no mere local boss. He was a conqueror who had united many tribes and already crushed countless foes in his rise to power. This Tyranid Hive Fleet sounded like the fight of a lifetime. Wasting no time, the Overfiend roared for all his warriors to mobilize. He marshaled the desperate Ork tribes of the sector and began fortifying key worlds for the oncoming onslaught. If the bugs wanted a war, the Orks would give them one. As Hive Fleet Leviathan drew near, it projected its infamous shadow in the warp, a sort of psychic blackout that normally cripples enemy psychers. But Ork Waaagh boys only cackled as their connection to the war-fueled weird synergy crackled chaotically. In fact, the impending carnage only made Ork psychers more erratic and dangerous. A bad omen for everyone in the war zone. Sure enough, Hive Fleet Leviathan Splinter didn't pause after devouring, or it drove deeper into Ork territory. The central world of Octarius itself, the Empire's namesake planet, essentially the Ork capital, soon came under attack. Only days after Orr's fall, the skies above Octarius darkened with yet another deluge of mice spores. But this time, the Orks were ready and waiting. As the first Tyranid spore pods ripped through Octarius's atmosphere, a great cacophonous cheer erupted from the green-skin hordes on the surface. This wasn't bravado. The Orks were genuinely delighted. One can easily imagine some Ork on the battlements hoisting his shooter and bellowing in crude low Gothic, "Oi, it's raining fight." Picture it, millions of Orks looking up at a sky literally filled with incoming enemies. And instead of despairing, they're celebrating. For the Orks, this was like an unexpected gift. At last, an all-you-can-fight buffet had arrived. The initial landings on Octarius were met with such ferocity that even the Tyranids momentarily felt the shock. When the spore pods burst open, they were greeted by a hurricane of Ork gunfire and the deafening war cries of mobs of boys charging headlong at them. Gigantic Ork war machines rolled forward on clanking treads or hovered on crude anti-grav engines, blasting bioforms apart with shells the size of small vehicles. The Orks had erected towering scrap fortresses and walls of steel teeth. Many of these fortifications were rigged with traps, explosives, and teetering piles of junk waiting to collapse onto invaders. As a spore landed near one Ork fort, an entire section of the ground sprung open, a hidden Ork kill zone, and dozens of Tyranid creatures toppled in, only to be met by a swarm of squigs, carnivorous pet creatures, and automated chopping blades. Other Tyranids were allowed to push deeper, lured intentionally through narrow alleys of scrap metal where Ork commandos, uncharacteristically sneaky greenkins, ambushed them from above with crude flamethrowers and snipping power saws. Yet for every clever Ork trick or booby trap, the Tyranids responded with equal parts ferocity and adaptability. If a choke point was too murderous to cross, the Hive Mind simply changed tactics, sending in burrowing beasts to undermine Ork defenses from below, or winged monstrosities to dive bomb from above. And always above Octarius hung the Tyranid bioships, each one a living factory pumping out endless reinforcements. The Orks could not let up for an instant, or the relentless swarm would overwhelm them. Octarius, the jewel of the Ork Empire, had become a living hellscape of constant battle, a war zone that spanned from its highest orbit to its deepest tunnels. Despite unimaginable losses on both sides, the war on Octarius and across the surrounding worlds had only just begun. In fact, each passing day only seemed to make the foes more dangerous. The Orks grew more savage and determined with every battle, surviving boys literally getting larger and tougher, their obsession with the fight intensifying. Ork spores bloomed in the blood-soaked soil wherever they died, promising new generations of greenkins if the Tyranids didn't scour them fast enough. The Tyranids, for their part, continuously adapted and evolved to counter the greenkins' tactics. Every engagement saw the Hive Mind spawning fresh monstrosities with tweaks designed to overcome whatever had stymied them before. Rather than one side simply crushing the other, the conflict itself was evolving into a bigger monster with each clash. What had started as Kryptman's ploy had now blossomed into a full-blown nightmare. The Octarius War, a conflict that would soon draw in even more forces and escalate to heights of brutality scarcely thought possible. Enter the prophet of Ghazul Threya. As the Octarius War raged on, it began to draw attention from more than just the immediate participants. Across the galaxy, orcs everywhere love a good scrap, and news, or at least rumors of the colossal battle, spread through the green-skinned grapevine. Eventually, these rumors reached the ears of the greatest orc warlord of the age. Ghazul Maguruk Threka, a name that makes imperial commanders shudder, was the self-proclaimed prophet of the war. Famous for orchestrating gargantuan orc invasions, he had recently been leading the notorious Third War for Armageddon against the human Imperium, a planet-wide conflict that had become a grinding stalemate against stubborn human defenders. Growing frustrated, or as orcs would say, dead bored with dislog, with a protracted fight on Armageddon, Ghazul decided it was time for something new. In 999 M41, near the close of the millennium, he abruptly departed Armageddon's war zones and set his sights on Octarius. If it was an apocalyptic battle he was looking for, Octarius promised to deliver beyond his wildest dreams. Ghazul's arrival in the Octarius sector was nothing short of spectacular. He and his cohorts crash-landed into the war zone like a green meteor of destruction. Wasting no time, the mighty warlord plunged straight into the fighting. Ghazul personally squared off against one of the largest Tyranid beasts he could find, a gigantic burrowing monstrosity known as a Mlock. In a display of brute strength and sheer Orsy exuberance, he managed to slay the Morlock in brutal combat, tearing the life out of the creature with power claw and gun and sheer indomitable will. This feat instantly earned him the awe and adoration of the local orcs, who were already predisposed to respect the biggest and baddest boss in the room. Here was a warlord who literally fell from the sky and killed the biggest thing around. Clearly, the prophet was someone worth following. With the Overfiend's forces battered by continuous war, Ghazul's arrival was a much-needed rallying point for the Greenkins. He gathered the fractious orc mobs and united them under a common cause. His cause, Ghazul was not there just to help. He was there to recruit. He proclaimed that this endless carnage was only the beginning, that he was assembling a new great war that would make all previous wars look tame. Under his charismatic, if bellows leadership, orcs from all over Octarius flocked to join his banner. For a time, the orcs surged back against the Tyranids, with renewed fervor inspired by Ghazul's vision of galactic conquest. Even the Tyranids seemed momentarily pressed as Ghazul's cool led massive counter-offensives, personally charging into the thickest fights like an incarnate god of war, bellowing praises to Gork and Mort, the orc gods of war and mayhem with each swing of his claw. However, Ghazul had bigger plans than just an endless holding action against Tyranids.
After a period of revitalizing the Octarius War effort, and likely cherry-picking the toughest orcs to join him, he decided it was time to move on. In classic orc fashion, he wasn't interested in fighting someone else's war forever. He wanted to start his own galaxy-shaking conflict, satisfied that the orcs of Octarius were sufficiently whipped into shape. And having had his fill of stomping alien bugs for the moment, Ghazul left as dramatically as he arrived. He gathered a colossal armada. By some estimates, it was a fleet of 5 million orc warships, crewed by the fiercest warriors he could rally, and he hurled it toward fresh targets among the stars. His parting gift to Octarius was to leave behind a slightly more organized green-skin defense, at least for a while hauling off vast hordes of boys to swell his new Waaagh. His departure was like a thunderbolt tearing away from the battlefield. The immediate war zone might have felt darker without his presence, but everyone understood that same thunderbolt was flying off to strike somewhere else, and hard. For the Imperium, Ghazul's emergence from Octarius at the head of an even greater following was the stuff of waking horror. Kryptman's gambit had, unintentionally, helped forge an even more terrifying orc invasion force under the most dangerous war boss in the galaxy. Ghazul's new Waaagh would soon begin carving a fresh trail of devastation toward Imperial territory. In time, its trajectory would bring it to the very doorstep of Holy Terror itself, but that is a story for another day. Back in the Octarius sector, the Orks that remained kept fighting, though without the Prophet's unifying presence. Their efforts quickly slid back into the usual chaotic, brutal free-for-all. Still, for as long as Gazul had been there, the Greenskins had managed to hold their own against the Tyranids in a way that must have given Kryptman a fleeting moment of hope. Perhaps the two monstrosities really would just annihilate one another. That hope did not last, and the war was nowhere near finished. Chaos reaps the harvest. As if the conflict needed more complications, the Octarius War soon drew the attention of the Chaos Gods, or at least the servants of one in particular, the Blood God. A war grinding out casualties by the millions is practically a shrine to Khorne, who cares not from where the blood flows, only that it does. Among the countless Chaos warbands roaming the stars, one in particular heard the psychic echoes of unending slaughter boiling out of Octarius and found it irresistible. This was the Skull Hunt, a warband of blood-mad Chaos Space Marines from the World Eaters Legion, led by a terrifying champion named Voda Bloodprice. Voda Bloodprice was a towering berserker clad in gore-slicked ceramite, utterly devoted to Khorne. When he learned of the Octarius meat grinder, an endless glut of skulls from two of the galaxy's most formidable Xenos races, he knew Khorne was testing him with an opportunity for unmatched bloodshed. He gathered the Skull Hunt, revved their Chanaxes, and hurled them into the Octarius sector, eager to heap offerings before the Blood God from the corpses of Orks and Tyranids alike. The arrival of the World Eaters added a fresh layer of hell to the conflict. Voda's warriors made no distinction between greenskin and alien bioform. Every skull was acceptable tribute. They crashed into battlefields where Orks and Tyranids were already tearing each other apart, and charged both sides with howling joy. Within a single year, the Skull Hunt had carved itself into bloody legend. Their trophy piles swelled into the thousands. It's said that over 8,000 notable skulls alone were claimed by Voda's band during that rampage, and considering Orks have notoriously thick skulls and Tyranid heads can be the size of boulders, you can imagine the spectacle of that grisly mound. From the tiniest Gretchen noggin to the massive cranium of a Tyranid Hierophant Biotitan, yes, they brought one of those towering monstrosities down as well. Voda's forces took them all. In one especially infamous duel, Voda Bloodprice slew an Ork warlord called Magza de Colas and claimed his enormous head, then seized the fallen Ork's massive great axe and used it to hack out the legs of a charging Hierophant. The beast crashed to the ground, and Voda claimed its titanic skull as the crowning piece of his collection. So immense was the carnage wrought by the Skull Hunt that Kay's gaze turned favorably upon Voda. Having piled up a mountain of worthy skulls and spilled rivers of blood, Voda Bloodprice was elevated to the rank of Demon Prince of Khorne, a reward for his fanatical dedication to slaughter. Ascension did nothing to cool his bloodlust. If anything, it magnified it. Now an immortal demon engine of war, Voda drew even more madmen to his banner. His forces swelled with additional Chaos warbands, bearing names like the Bloodblessed, Bloody Dawn, Gorefists and Harvest, each no doubt with its own grisly saga. Chaos cultists, crazed mutant berserkers, beastmen drawn by the stench of slaughter, corrupted knights, and traitor tech priests of the Dark Mechanicum, all flocked to his call. This fusion of chaos forces grew into a full-blown legion of bloodletting. In his newfound demonic arrogance, Voda set his sights on crafting the ultimate arena of war to delight Khorne. He chose as his target a particular embattled Ork world deep within the Octarius war zone, a world the Greenskins themselves had dubbed Damn, likely because it was a planet-sized maw of ceaseless feeding and fighting between Orks and Tyranids. On Damor, the wars raged on colossal scales with whole continents consumed in battle. To Voda this was paradise, a never-ending gladiatorial pit under a blood-red sky. He used his flagship gore-drenched to lead his armada into the planet's orbit, smashing past Greenskin and Tyranid ships and aiming to land on the world to engage in total slaughter. Amid such insanity,
It's hard to say that the Skull Hunts campaign significantly changed the overall course of the Octarius War. Orks and Tyranids were going to keep fighting regardless, but it certainly didn't help matters for anyone, just hoping the two Xenos would destroy each other quietly. If anything, the Chaos incursion added even more bodies to the grinder and more fuel to the fire. And should any observer have dared to hope that maybe the Tyranids would neatly eat the Orks and then starve, or the Orks would neatly bash the Tyranids and then settle down, those hopes went up in the demonic flames of Voda's onslaught. The Octarius sector was officially out of anyone's control. It was now a playground for the galaxy's most destructive forces, all thanks to Kryptman's high-stakes gamble. The Imperium draws a line. Cordon impenetra. Back in the halls of the Imperium, alarm bells were ringing louder than ever about what was unfolding in Octarius. Inquisitor Kryptman's grand experiment had by now spiraled into an uncontrollable wildfire of war. Far from conveniently eliminating two threats, the Octarius War appeared to be strengthening them. Imperial tacticians grimly observed Ork and Tyranid forces growing in size and ferocity through constant battle. The nightmare scenario was clear. If either side broke out of the Octarius sector, it would unleash a supercharged horde upon the vulnerable Imperium. The Imperials knew they needed to act, not to end the war. They had neither the numbers nor the proximity to do so easily, but to contain it. Enter Inquisitor Nashir Sahan soon, a colleague of Kryptman's, and likely one of many who had bitterly criticized Kryptman's gambit. Sahanson proposed a drastic containment plan dubbed Cordon Impenetra. The idea was simple in concept, if horrifying in execution. Draw an imaginary boundary around the Octarius War and declare everything inside it a loss. Any Imperial worlds still within that sphere were to be written off, their populations abandoned to whatever fate awaited, be it rampaging Orks, ravenous Tyranids, or the crossfire between. All Imperial forces would instead rally on the outside of this cordon, fortifying every neighboring sector and system
To the teeth. Essentially, it was a quarantine on a sector-wide scale, wall off the infection, and pray it doesn't spread. In practice, Cordon Impenetra meant unimaginable sacrifice. Dozens of fringe Imperial colonies, mining outposts, and even fully developed hive worlds that fell inside the cordon were left to fend for themselves. Some were evacuated in time, but many more were not, either due to lack of resources or simply the cruel calculus of war. Imperial commanders concentrated their strength on key border systems, transforming them into bulwarks. Fortress worlds bristled with newly built defenses and mobilized militias. Battle fleets prowled the void, ready to intercept any Tyranid biohips or Ork rocks that dared to wander out of the Octarius madhouse. Propaganda declared it a heroic last stand to protect humanity. Though one imagines the poor souls left on the wrong side of the line felt rather less enthused about being the sacrificial pawns in this gambit. As part of the cordon strategy, Imperial forces also tried to covertly destabilize the warring Xenos from afar. Kill teams and assassins were dispatched on risky missions aimed at decapitating leaders or sabotaging resources. One famous operation, Senemd Spinebreak, involved a contingent of veteran Death Corps of guardsmen infiltrating an Ork-held world, the Ash Dunes of Fendather, to eliminate a particularly inventive Ork big mech named Cogfist Steel Snapper, whose monstrous scrap factory was churning out engines of war for the Greenkins. After many weeks of preparation, the teams began their stealth assault on a moonless night. Crawling on their bellies through toxic mud, the grim-faced soldiers advanced beneath the crude walls of the Ork scrap city, clamping melter charges to gate hinges and silently knifing lone sentries in the dark. Not every team made it through. Some squads were discovered by roving Ork war bikers or prowling squig beasts and died fighting in the shadows, but enough penetrated deep into the Ork camp. At a preset hour, they struck in unison. Ammo dumps erupted in chain reaction blasts and fuel reservoirs went up in pillars of fire. Amid the chaos, one kill team even breached Cogfist's personal mech workshop, ambushing the big mech
and cutting him down with point-blank melter fire. By dawn, the green-skinned stronghold was an inferno of collapsing scrap and panicked orcs. Operation Spinebreak didn't end the war, but it decapitated one of the Orks' key war factories and sowed confusion in their ranks. A hard-won spark of hope amid otherwise dark days. Despite such efforts, it soon became evident that no amount of surgical strikes would stop the Octarius War from spilling over. The sheer pressure of millions of Orks and Tyranids at war was like a contained supernova. Cracks were inevitable. Within a relatively short time, both Xenos forces began to test the limits of the Imperial cordon. Sometimes accidentally, sometimes quite intentionally. Joan Stealer, cults, those sneaky Tyranid infiltrators that had been hiding on Imperial worlds just outside the war zone, chose this moment to launch uprisings, sensing their Hive fleet on the horizon. Several planets that should have been safe rear areas suddenly erupted in civil rebellion as human cultists revealed themselves and sabotaged defenses in preparation for tyranny arrival. Planets like Darkmont, Ahelna, and Saint's Blessing experienced coordinated uprisings from within, a nightmare of betrayal. On Darkmont, for instance, the PDF, Planetary Defense Force, barracks erupted in violence as previously loyal soldiers sprouted additional arms and chitinous mutations, turning their guns on their officers. Whole mining unions and underhive gangs revealed symbols of the four-armed cult they had secretly served, sabotaging defense batteries and opening fortress gates to welcome the Sky Eatators they had prophesied. By the time Tyranid spores rained down, these worlds were already in chaos, their defenders in disarray or outright subverted by the insidious Gene Stealer cults. The cultists foolishly rejoiced as the Hive fleet descended, only to become the first course of the Tyranids' feast, consumed alongside everyone else once the Xenos arrived. Meanwhile, opportunistic Ork warlords on the fringes saw lightly defended human systems beyond the cordon, and never ones to pass up a good fight or easy loot, began launching their own raids outward. Holding the line was going to be anything but easy for the Imperium. Battles on the frontier. The next phase of the Octarius conflict turned into a series of ferocious battles across the frontier systems. To the galactic north of Octarius relative to the cordon, a subsector called Pancalis became a major hot zone. It was here that both Tyranid vanguards and Ork war bands pushed outward almost simultaneously, turning human worlds into their new battlegrounds. Imperial governors in Pancalis found their astropathic distress calls answered not just by Imperial reinforcements, but unfortunately by the enemy as well. On some worlds, the threat came from within. Sleeper agents of the Jaune Stealer cults had been lurking in the shadows, and now they struck planets like Darkmontel and Saint's Blessing experienced coordinated uprisings. Mining workers, underhive gangs, even elements of the local defense forces suddenly revealed extra limbs and alien sigils, declaring their allegiance to the Tyranid Hive Mind. These traitors sabotaged planetary defense lasers, opened fortress gates, and assassinated key leaders, all to soften their worlds up for the incoming swarm. When the skies darkened with Tyranid spores, these cultists rejoiced as if welcoming gods, only to be devoured alongside everyone else once the Hive fleet descended. Such is the inevitable reward for those who throw in their lot with the Great Devourer. On other worlds, the Green Tide was the first to arrive. An Ork warlord named Stugrog de Sigrinda hacked a trail of devastation through the Pancalis subsector with his fleet. In one brutal campaign, his boys overran the feral world of Talem in a storm of fire and noise. The primitive human tribes there never stood a chance against power-armored knobs and roaring Ork wagons. The death world of Nazcar came next. Its carnivorous jungles and venomous wildlife slowed the Orks only a little. If anything, the greenskins found the megafauna fun to hunt. The proud fortress world of Caste held out the longest. Its high walls and disciplined regiments held back wave after wave of greenskin assaults, turning its surface into a patchwork of smoldering battle zones. But even Caste couldn't endure forever once the Orks rolled out their biggest guns. After a grinding siege, the planet's defenses buckled and Caste fell silent, another trophy on Stugrog's growing list of conquests. Stugrog wasn't the only warlord on the move. A particularly cunning Ork from the Deathskulls clan, Nabrut Stubfingers, launched an attack on the heavily industrialized Kernak system. Kernak III was a forge world of the Adeptus Mechanicus, packed with vital manufactoria and sacred tech relics, an irresistible prize for any loot-hungry Ork. And all Orks love loot, but a head-on assault against a forge world is no small task, even for an Ork armada. Stubfingers, however, possessed a devious streak rare among his kind. He had somehow captured a small flotilla of Imperial vessels during an earlier raid. These ships, now crewed by enslaved human techs under the watchful eyes of Ork overseers, translated into the Kernak system, broadcasting legitimate Imperial clearance codes. The Mechanicus orbital defenses, momentarily fooled by the proper transponder signals, hesitated just long enough. Without warning, the friendly ship suddenly accelerated and rammed straight into the massive orbital defense platforms and gun stations guarding Kernak III, annihilating themselves and tearing vast gaps in the ring of defenses. Before the stunned defenders could recover, Stubfinger's main fleet of rust-caked warships and titanic space hulks smashed into orbit. Ork boarding pods and rocks asteroids converted into brutal attack craft rained down by the hundreds. The skies over Kernak III became a storm of fire as the Mechanicus desperately tried to shoot down the incoming barrage. At the same time, another Ork leader, Warlord Kagrit, the Red Tooth of the brutal Goth clan, turned his attention to the nearby Agra world of Kusolst and several neighboring systems, piling yet more chaos onto the region. It quickly became obvious the Orks weren't acting under a single unified command. Gazul had long since departed. Instead, a swarm of individual war bosses were seizing the opportunity to grab territory and glory wherever they could. For the Imperium, the effect was the same catastrophe on multiple fronts. The Tyranids, meanwhile, were extending their grip as well. Splinter tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan began infesting systems like Analani, Dianza's Hollow, and Giddis. These weren't major core worlds, but they provided more than enough biomass for the swarm to gorge itself. In the Giddis system, for example, there was a world blanketed in iron-hard forests of metallic iron beech trees. The Tyranids devoured everything, digesting even the metal-laced flora. Another planet in the system was home to vast herds of colossal sauroid beasts. They too were stripped to the bone, leaving only cracked skeletons beneath deserted skies. Elsewhere, the Tyranids emptied labyrinthine cave networks lit by glowing megafungi and swallowed entire flotillas of ocean-going tribal populations on a water world. Each conquest fed more DNA and biomass into the Tyranid organism, which in turn spawned new broods of bioforms better suited to the diverse environments they were consuming. Amid all this, chaos forces continued to stir the pot. Isolated human populations, cut off and terrified, turned to the worship of dark gods, further complicating everything. On one world, Kusk, the situation escalated into a full-scale demonic incursion. Rolling warp storms tore open the sky, and hordes of gibbering daemons poured into real space. Picture it, as if Orks and Tyranids weren't bad enough. Now bloodletters and plague-bearers were cavorting through burning hive cities. In this multi-sided nightmare, many Imperial commanders had no choice but to abandon untenable positions and withdraw whatever forces they could to more secure lines. Yet despite the bleakness, the Imperium did not simply collapse. Far from it. Heroic efforts were underway to hold the line and strike back where possible. The Xenos hunters of the Death Watch, operating from a watch fortress known as the Eye of Octos, committed kill teams to vital missions, assassinating key alien bioforms, sabotaging strategic targets, and advising embattled worlds on how to counter specific Tyranid creatures. Several chapters of Space Marines answered the call to arms. Among them were crusading forces of the Black Templars, as well as Primaris-founded chapters like the Wolf Spear, an offshoot of the Space Wolves lineage, the Dark Krakens, void-hardened Marines used to aquatic and night fighting, the Atlantean Spears, and the Obsidian Jaguars. Each brought their own tactics and ethos to the fight. Imperial strategos formed ad hoc coalitions. For example, on one embattled planet, ominously named Death of Banzia, Captain Cray Lucor of the Dark Krakens coordinated with battle leader Rakmer Blue Wolf of the Wolf Spear and Watchmaster Akrep of the Death Watch, together with Lord General Militant Arnold Hifast of the Astra Militarum. They orchestrated a counter-offensive against Tyranid swarms rampaging across that world's icy forests. In one notable engagement, the Wolf Spear lured a stampede of Tyranids into a mountain pass and triggered a massive avalanche with well-placed melter charges. Tons of snow and rock swept down, burying thousands of chittering gaunts and warrior beasts, even dragging larger monstrosities into an ice-choked lake. The moment of triumph was short-lived. Mere minutes later, half-frozen Tyranids began clawing their way out of the icy mere, shaking off frost and resuming the slaughter. Likewise, on another world, ingenious human defenders lured a Tyranid swarm onto the surface of a great frozen lake by retreating across it, then detonated charges to crack the ice. Entire broods vanished into the black, frigid waters with a hissing screech. Yet even that was not the end. Disturbing shapes still wriggled beneath the ice chunks, and before long some of the monsters surfaced, horribly unfazed by the cold. These were stark reminders that even nature's fury wasn't always enough to extinguish the Tyranid threat. Elsewhere, the Dark Krakens discovered that Leviathan's organisms were attempting a sinister form of adaptation. The Tyranids were hunting local apex predators to incorporate their genetics. On one frontier world, packs of intelligent Ursan wolves, massive, cunning pack hunters native to the permafrost, were being stalked by Tyranid lurs and other gene-harvesting creatures. The idea that the Hive Mind might acquire the traits of these apex predators, their pack coordination, keen senses, and resilience to cold, was terrifying. The Space Marines launched a campaign in the frozen forests to prevent this. They fought not only Tyranids lurking among the snow-laden pines, but also had to contend with the Ursan wolves themselves, who didn't exactly appreciate human interference in their territory. Several Dark Krakens Marines met their end beneath the fangs of enraged alpha wolves, even as they struggled to take down Tyranid creatures in the same breath. Ultimately, through fire and perseverance, the Marines managed to drive off or kill the Tyranid Biovore teams and secure the gene hunts, but at the cost of many lives and months of harsh warfare. On the Ork side of things, Imperial forces had equally bizarre encounters. The Mechanicus defenders of Kernuk III, led by a resolute fabricator general, fought tooth and nail against Stubfinger's Orks. Legions of Qatari, cybernetic soldiers of the Mechanicum, and maniples of battle automata clashed with wave upon wave of bellowing Ork boys and clanking Ork war machines. The skies over the Forge world were lit with laser fire, flak burst, and strange sparkling force fields from oddball Ork contraptions. Despite their initial cunning entry, the Orks eventually resorted to their favorite strategy: overwhelming force and mayhem. They deployed towering mega-gargants, essentially walking fortresses bristling with guns, which engaged in duels against the Mechanicus's giant Titan war machines amid the burning manufacturum districts. Tech priests chanted binary prayers as massive plasma reactors exploded and city-sized foundries collapsed. Even with valor and technology on the Imperial side, raw numbers began to tell. Billions, yes, billions of greenkins were flooding Kernuk. 3 Ork mech boys had a field day looting the Mechanicus workshops. Soon the Orks were turning captured Imperial tanks
and night walkers back against their former owners after giving them a suitably Orsy makeover, which usually involved more spikes, loud paint jobs, and questionable safety features like extra fuel tanks strapped to the back. After a grueling campaign, the Fabricator General of Kernuk III had to face facts. The world was lost, swallowing pride and clinging to discipline. She organized an orderly retreat, as orderly as one can be with enraged orcs, hot on your heels. Crucial machinery was rigged to self-destruct to deny the enemy prizes, and thousands of Qatari gave their lives, holding back the green tide, while evacuation ships lifted off, loaded with tech priests and surviving civilians. In the end, great plumes of smoke and chemical fire marked the fall of Kernuk III, as orcs rampaged through its once hallowed halls of industry. And so it went on numerous worlds, a patchwork of heroism and tragedy, of temporary victories and bitter defeats. The Imperium was effectively fighting a war of containment, trying to save what they could and delay the Xenos from breaking out further. They achieved some success. Some Ork incursions were stalled or forced to redirect. Some tyranny splinters were blunted or lured into traps. But it was clear that, as long as the main meat grinder in Octarius churned, new horrors would continue to emerge from it. I note on inquisitorial ingenuity, the Imperium's efforts weren't limited to defense and brute force. Inquisitor Svan Roth of the Ordo Xenos hatched an extraordinary plan to turn Ork technology against the Tyranids. His Death Watch teams had recovered an invention from an Ork mech boy, essentially a crown implanted in the mech skull that disrupted the synaptic control signals of the Tyranids. If this bizarre device could disrupt the Hive Mind's control, it might tilt battles in the Imperium's favor. With a mix of audacity and scientific curiosity, Van Roth led an experimental task force to a remote Eller-maiden world called Valoria, where isolated pockets of Orks and Tyranids were still slugging it out, alongside Imperial Guard regiments and Margot's biologist tech priests. He even enlisted the reluctant help of Eller survivors knowledgeable in the world's labyrinthine terrain to orchestrate a test. Unfortunately, what followed was yet another microcosm of the Octarius War's brutality. The crown device proved finicky, working only in the hands of captive Ork mech boys, and even then with inconsistent results. Before any breakthrough could be achieved, a roving Ork fleet, perhaps drawn by the psychic peculiarity of the device, descended on Valoria. Van Roth's expedition turned into a desperate scramble in fierce mountain fighting amidst three factions: Imperials, Eldar, Orks, and lurking Tyranids. The Allies managed to detonate a major Eldar structure to cover their escape. The test was essentially a failure. Most of Van Roth's team perished. The device was lost, and whatever slim hope it offered faded into the jungle night. It was emblematic of the Octarius War. Even the most inventive gambits found themselves drowned in the sea of unrelenting Xenos violence. The last stand of Sigma Ulster. One world in particular became a focal point of Imperial hopes and fears: the Forge world Sigma Ulster. This planet lay on the edge of the cordon and was deemed too strategically vital to abandon. It was a major manufacturing hub filled with weapons factories and also functioned as an astropathic relay critical for communications. Due to its industrial output, used as an astropath relay post and strategically important location, Sigma Olari was the only system in the cordon impenetra that Inquisitor Sahansen did not abandon. Commanded by Fabricator General Enrich Flagster, its defenses were formidable. The world bristled with a vast fleet of defense monitors and tens of thousands of Qatari macrolades. Flagster fortified his world to an extreme degree, surrounding it with orbital platforms and layered shields and amassing countless legions of Qatari combat servitors and towering battle automata. Night houses swore their lances of giant walkers to the defense, and the Titan Legio Ferrocastum stood ready with guard engines armed for apocalyptic battle. However, millions of refugees now fled to the world, with many being used as slave labor by the Callus Mechanicum.
The rest were herded into camps on nearby worlds or left to rot aboard crowded transport ships. As the refugee crisis swelled, the first sign of Tyranid bioships in the system was discovered. If there was any place that could hold the line, Sigma Olari was it, and hold the line. It did for a time. First came the Tyranids. A probing tendril of Leviathan struck first at the ocean world of Daria in the Sigma Olari system, likely intending to use it as a stepping stone. The defenders on Daria answered with ingenuity rather than brute force. Fleets of armed submersibles and aircraft carrying atomic depth charges lured a major swarm of aquatic Tyranid organisms into a vast trap out at sea, then annihilated them in one coordinated ambush. It was a brutal, hard-won victory, but it proved the Xenos could be beaten under the right conditions. Next, the Hive Fleet came for Sigma Olari itself. Thanks to the planet's foul, heavily polluted oceans and atmosphere, the byproduct of relentless industry, the Tyranids found the environment far from ideal. The defenders had an unlikely ally in their own toxic seas. Hive Mind scouts, Genon stealers and lysers, identified the waters as dangerously corrosive and seeded pheromone markers warning other bioforms away, forcing the Tyranids into narrower, safer landing corridors. In those choke points, the Imperials unleashed everything they had. Masked Qatari phalanxes, armored columns of tanks, towering night suits, and ranks of massive battle surfters swinging electro-mauls formed kill zones. Holy Sisters of Battle joined the defense of the forged spires, their bolters and flamers stitching fire through the swarms. Above, Imperial Navy squadrons and Mechanicus warships locked horns with clouds of Tyranid bioships, turning the high atmosphere into a constant display of exploding hulls and burning debris. Sigma Olari's might was enough to break the initial invasion, barely. The Tyranids were finally repulsed by a single hugely risky operation. Nearly all of the Imperial hunter-killer flotillas massed in one region to lure in the swarm, only for flights of gunships to drop atomic depth charges into the poisoned seas at the decisive moment. Victory came at a terrible price. Millions of Tyranid creatures still remained scattered across the surface and oceans, all of which would have to be hunted down and destroyed in the aftermath. The defenders had scarcely drawn breath when the Orks made their move. A new horde, led by a camo-cloaked bloodaxe warlord named Zagrob Dabucha, slipped into the system. Yes, these Orks actually employed camouflage and infiltration. Unusual, but not unheard of, especially with bloodaxe mercenary influence in the mix. After translating into system, Zagrob's forces struck the quarry world of Maxim, clashing with the world's heavily armed stone cartels and lumber syndicates. The Orks used stealth in the forests, seizing many of the lumber syndicate's enormous logging landships and converting them into crude but terrifying war engines. The locals finally secured victory by turning the Orks' own prize against them, using the captured landships to lure Zagrob onto a cliff face wired with explosives, then detonating it and sending the greenskins tumbling into the abyss below. With Zagrob killed in the blast and the ensuing confusion, the Imperials clawed out a Pyrrhic victory on Maxim. But Maxim was only the opening act. Within weeks, Sigma Olari itself came under Ork assault, not once, but twice. The first attack was beaten back. The second followed only a few weeks later under a new warlord, Ugul Ironboot. The exhausted defenders were forced to muster yet again. As with the Tyranids before them, the greenskins had little choice but to land on the Forge world's few scattered landmasses. Sigma Olari is mostly ocean. Even so, the defenders were stretched thin. Some Ork forces blundered into pockets of surviving Tyranids and, true to form, immediately started brawling with the bioforms instead of the Imperials. That bit of unintended help, combined with the sheer stubborn power of the Forge world's defenses, allowed the Imperials to eventually hurl the Orks back. Fabricator General Flagstalk, however, understood the grim truth in their current state. Sigma Olari could not endure another major assault. Sure enough, the next invasion to fall upon Sigma Olari was the largest yet. A colossal Tyranid wave arrived, and this time the Xenos had adapted.
Several bioforms now showed resistance to the noxious chemical oceans, and the Hive Fleet deployed massive tunneling beasts. The Tyranids came perilously close to securing a beachhead at one of Sigma Olari's principal forge spires, Tatus Secundos, but were thwarted by the sacrificial heroism of Baron Keon of House Galerius, who led his knight into battle alongside squadrons of Imperial Navy aircraft. It was not enough to stem the tide everywhere. More and more forge spires came under direct assault as Tyranids exploited refuge tunnels and bored upward into the lower levels. Hundreds of
thousands of Qatari and Electro priests died, bringing down tunneling biotitans as large as Ordinata siege engines. Imperial strength was nearing its limits. Then came even worse news. An enormous Ork invasion fleet was inbound. The greenskins appeared without warning, carried in by surprise, warp storms erupting from within the Ork empire of Octarius itself. At their head was war boss Tosca Grob, world killer, leading a horde from the notoriously savage Snakebite clan. World killers, Snakebite hordes, barreled into the system, full of pent-up aggression from fighting Tyranids in Octarius. Effectively, a battle-hardened Third Army, crashing the party. World Killer's appearance took the Tyranids by surprise, as much as it did the Imperials, forcing biohip armadas that were finishing off the remaining Imperial vessels to break off and intercept the Greenskin armada. On the surface, the Greenskins engaged Tyranids, attacking other Forge World outposts, and a three-way slaughter broke out. World Killer himself targeted the capital of Sigma Ulstari and fabricator General Phlogiston's own seat, the Forge Spire of Alpha Primeros. The war boss sent enormous hordes to attack both primary routes to the Forge Spire. One route through Alpha Tertius, a sprawl of kilometer-high wreckage and mangled superstructures where confused infantry combat erupted amidst the ruined metal, and the other along the Cogway, a massive fortified causeway leading to the Citadel gates. In the chaos of Alpha Tertius, Ork commandos hunted their foes through the twisted wreckage, while stalwart battle sisters purged chamber after chamber of lurking Tyranids. On the Cogway, not even the towering titans of Legio Ferricastrum and the noble knights of House Securus could fully stem the tide of rampaging Ork Gargants and stampeding Squidigoths. The defenders were pushed to the brink on both fronts. High Marshal Helbreck of the Black Templars had by this time arrived in the sector with a relief force as part of an Indemitus Crusade fleet. Alongside him came a rogue trader Grand Cruiser captained by Lady Ava Falamore and an Imperial Navy battle group led by High Admiral Haraka Arjon, as well as Task Force 5 of Indemitus Crusade Fleet Primus. Most imposing of all was the arrival of the Eternal Crusader flagship of the Black Templars chapter bearing Helbreck himself. The newly arrived Imperial forces wasted no time. The fleet broke up and set course for different targets. Several Black Templar warships moved to reinforce other besieged worlds in the system, while the rest smashed through the cordon of battling Ork and Tyranid ships around Sigma Ori. In a matter of hours, the Imperials had broken through and were arriving in orbit of Sigma Ori itself, landing waves of troop transports loaded with millions of reinforcements, Imperial Guard, tanks, knights, and titans. Many of these landers were lost to marauding Ork aircraft and Tyranid flyers, but many more made it planetside. With them came the Black Templars and two other Adeptus Artis chapters, the Rift Priors and Axes of the Emperor, whose drop pods and gunships deployed straight into the fiercest fighting. Helbreck took command of the defense, personally coordinating with fabricator General Phlogiston. Though Mechanicus pride meant coordination was not perfect, the Rift Priors and Axes of the Emperor landed at Alpha Tertius under heavy gunship support, as lances of knights from House Deros and House Mandus moved to relieve the Cogway defenders. However, World Killer would not be denied his prize and continued to push through the Cogway toward Alpha Primeros. Despite the new arrivals, using 6 gigantic explosive-rigged battering rams pulled by armored Orkiosauruses, enormous reptilian beasts outfitted as living siege engines. World Killer attempted to smash through the final wave of defenses. Helrak himself realized the gravity of the moment and rushed to intervene. The High Marshal quickly devised a daring counter. He noted that the Orkiosauruses' multi-story tall armored house war platforms on their backs were unshielded on top, though ground fire hadn't stopped them. Perhaps a direct strike to the beast and crew could. He ordered squads of Black Templars and Mechanicus Sicarian infiltrators to use jump packs and flyers to board the moving behemoths under heavy Aeronautica Imperialis fighter cover. The Space Marines and Qatari launched themselves at the towering Orkiosauruses. Barely half the Imperial craft reached their targets. Ork fighter planes swarmed them, knocking many from the sky. But those who did managed to land on the massive beasts. Helrak himself slammed down onto the foremost Orkiosaurus, the one believed to be carrying World Killer. Vicious battles erupted atop the swaying, stomping Orkiosaur platforms. Black Templars and Qatari fought hand-to-hand against mobs of surprised Orks on the beasts' backs. High above the battlefield, Helrak cut through waves of Ork knobs in the multi-level Hauer, making his way to the largest green skin of all. War Boss, Tusker Grob, World Killer. The duel between Helrak and World Killer was the stuff of legend. The Ork towered even over the armored Space Marine, a muscle-bound giant clad in iron plates and trophies of past kills. He wielded a massive clawed power fist and a jagged cleaver the size of a person. Hel, a veteran of 1,000 battles, met him with the holy fury of the Emperor, his black sword swinging, storm shield raised. They traded blows amid the rocking, swaying platform as the Orkiosaurus lumbered forward. World Killer's strength was immense. One backhanded strike snapped Helbrek's arm. Another hammer-like punch cracked the High Marshal's skull helm and knocked him to one knee. An excited chorus of Ork roared in triumph, thinking their boss was about to take a Space Marine chapter master's head as a trophy. As Vol Keller hoisted his mighty blade for a decapitating strike, Helbrek, in desperation, drew his ancient combi melter pistol duty's burden with his one good hand. At point-blank range, he fired a blast of superheated melter into the war boss's chest. The shot punched through World Killer's crude armor, melting flesh and sending the giant Ork staggering in agony. Helrak seized the moment. With a cry to the God Emperor, he lunged forward and drove his power sword straight through World Killer's thick skull. The beast of a war boss finally toppled his demise, sending a shock through the Ork horde. With World Killer slain, the tide turned. On that Orkiosaur's back, Black Templars raised Helrak up in victory. Though injured, he lived, albeit surely with a pounding headache and some broken bones to remember the fight. The other boarding team succeeded in overrunning or sabotaging the remaining Orkiosaur, halting the momentum of the Ork assault. At the carway, the leaderless Orks faltered just as Imperial reinforcements pressed in, and the Gargants were finally brought down by concentrated fire, and a few heroic last stands by Knights and Titans. Piece by bloody piece, the Imperial defenders and their timely reinforcements reclaimed the ground. The battered Tyranids, for their part, found themselves suddenly outmatched. Their bioships in orbit had been disrupted by the Ork fleet arrival, and the Imperial naval counterattack, leaving many ground swarms cut off from the Hive Mind support. Some Tyranid creatures went berserk or became easy pickings in isolated pockets. Others were happily set upon by vengeful Orks now that their big boss was dead. Even an Ork route tends to get distracted if there are still enemies to bash. By the end of this gargantuan engagement, Sigma Ulari still stood, devastated in large sections, reeking of Prometheum and alien but standing High Marshal Helrak, wounded but victorious, was asked how his beleaguered forces had managed to hold against such impossible odds. His answer was typically stoic: faith and fire we stood, and the enemies of man broke upon us as they always will if our resolve is strong. The defense of Sigma Ulstari became a rare beacon of hope in the Octarius War. It showed that even amid the greatest horrors, the Imperium could muster the strength and a bit of luck to prevail. However, it was a defensive victory. The heart of the Octarius sector, the Ork Empire, and the Tyranid invasion remained locked in mutual extermination beyond the Imperium's reach. All Helbrecht's forces and the Cordon had achieved was to stave off the war's expansion at great cost. However, true to form, the Imperial victors could not entirely avoid infighting. Fabricator General Phagisto, prideful lord of Sigma Olari's forges, was reportedly furious that High Marshal Helbrecht and the Crusade forces had acted without consulting him or the Mechanicus chain of command. In a pique, Phagisto redirected much of his attention to securing his own forge holdings rather than supporting broader coalition efforts. Even in victory, the Imperium's unity was fragile. The Swarmlord's gambit. Tyranides take the upper hand. While the Imperium and others were grappling with the war's spillover within the Octarius sector itself, the conflict between Orks and Tyranids was reaching a fever pitch. The Tyranid Hive Mind, ever adaptive, decided to commit one of its most cunning and formidable bioorganisms to finally tip the scales. The Swarmlord, this ancient, ever-regenerating Tyranid strategos, had faced the Imperium's greatest heroes in the past, and now it arrived to bring cold calculation to the feral chaos of Octarius. Under the Swarmlord's direction, Hive Fleet Leviathan launched a coordinated sector-wide offensive to break the Ork Empire once and for all. The Swarmlord's approach was systematic and merciless. It began by isolating and besieging each remaining Ork-held planet one by one. Rather than allowing the Orks to concentrate their forces, Tyranid bioships swarmed into every system, cutting off warp routes and slaughtering any Ork ships attempting to move between worlds. The Orks, for all their love of a straight-up brawl, were now scattered and increasingly fractured. One by one, their outlying strongholds began to fall. The world of Orrok, not to be confused with Orrok, a different Ork-infested rock with a similar fate, was overrun in a matter of days. Perhaps a few stubborn green-skinned survivors had tried to rebuild camps there after the first invasions, or maybe fresh spores had only just begun to take root. It didn't matter. The Tyranids descended in strength and stripped Orrok bare, sucking up every last scrap of biomass. The orbital junk port of Ormok became the stage for a colossal void war. Dozens of ramshackle Ork kill cruisers, looted Imperial frigates, and converted asteroids hurled themselves at titanic Tyranid bioships amid storms of spores and cannon fire. One Ork captain howled with glee as his rusted hulk, gore paint, smashed full broadside into a whale-sized bioship, blowing open the beast's innards and spilling half his own crew into the void along with it. At the same time, swarms of smaller Tyranid void organisms latched onto Ork escorts, dissolving through hull plating and spewing boarding broods into the corridors within. It was void warfare at its rawest and most savage. When the guns finally fell silent, the Ork fleet in that sector was effectively destroyed, and the Tyranid bioships advanced to finish off the orbital dock itself. In a grotesque twist, thousands of Tyranid harvester beasts slithered through the shattered sections of Ormok, slaughtering any surviving Orks and then digesting the port's very superstructure for resources. Another notable Ork bastion was the asteroid fortress called Gork's Bonce, a colossal hollowed rock turned weapons foundry, where big mech oilers churned out insane contraptions to hurl at the Tyranids. The Orks had prepared some nasty surprises here. Rows of bizarre artillery that spat arcs of green lightning, capable of frying entire broods in a single discharge, and gravity-warping cannons able to crush even a Carnifex into a puddle of goo. Much of the fighting on Gork's Bonce took place in cramped corridors and killbox choke points. The Orks knew intimately, allowing for brutal blood-axe ambushes and boarding raids against Tyranid bioships. For a time, it seemed the greenskins might actually hold this fortress, But the Swarmlord was not above turning Ork-style tricks against the Orks themselves. Before the main assault, it had seeded tens of thousands of gene-stealers and lictors, chameleonic Tyranid stalkers throughout the asteroid, ordering them to lie dormant and await further commands. When the primary attack began, these infiltrators struck from behind. Power conduits were sabotaged. Airlocks cycled open into the void. Key Ork bosses were found with their throats torn out in the dark. As the fortress defenses began to unravel in a storm of internal sabotage and confusion, the main Tyranid force attacked from every direction at once. Even the mighty mech guns were eventually silenced as their crews were ripped apart or dragged screaming into vents by chittering horrors. Gork's Bonce was overrun, its great forges going dark as the Tyranids devoured every squig, grot, and orc they could find, then chewed up the leftover scrap metal for good measure. Waste nothing. On the world of Dakazot, famous for its sprawling underground cave networks, and the legions of speed-obsessed orc bikers who used them as racetracks, the war took on a subterranean character. At first, the greenskins were having the time of their lives, quite literally. They triggered cave-ins to bury clusters of Tyranid tunnelers under tons of rubble, and staged insane high-speed chases through luminescent fungus-lit caverns, running down any skittering beast foolish enough to show itself. For a while, under these conditions, the Tyranids struggled to pin down the hypermobile orc speed freaks, but under the Hive Mind's guidance, the Xenos changed tactics. Winged Tyranid organisms were redirected into cave entrances elsewhere, and soon hundreds of airborne creatures with flame-spouting proboscises were saturating the underground highways with incendiary gel. Entire tunnel networks turned into blazing oven pipes, roasting orcs and Tyranids alike in indiscriminate sheets of fire. Simultaneously, heavyweight burrowing organisms gnawed at the peripheries of the cave network, causing strategic collapses to cut off escape routes, trapped in their own elaborate warren with bee and bioacid floods coming from above and walls crumbling around them. Many speed freaks met a toasty end. The victory that orcs had enjoyed turned to panic as they realized the paths ahead were blocked and the ones behind were filled with slithering death. Dazod's once raucous caverns fell eerily quiet after the Tyranids flushed them clean. Perhaps the most spectacular showdown of this final stage took place on the planet Bad Squig. Bad Squig was a prime orc world teeming with billions of orcs and an ecosystem full of their bizarre creatures, not least of which were the mighty squigosaurs, colossal reptilian beasts that some especially daring orcs rode into battle like dragons. Here, a hulking war boss named Grognard Stomp Crumper decided it was time for a glorious last stand, or as he called it, the time of the big kill. He rallied every orc on the planet, banging heads together, sometimes literally, to get clans that normally fought each other to cooperate. Stomper mobilized every orc upon the surface and declared da time of da big kill. This war boss embodied the never say die spirit of his race. In one battle he personally tried to tame a captured carnifex like a wild squigth, a foolish stunt that cost him an arm, a leg, and an eye. But he merely viewed these crippling injuries as a setback. He got bionic replacements, bragged about them, and went right back to the fight. Under Stomp Crumper's command, Bad Squig became an arena of constant frenzied combat. The orcs reveled in it, piling up mountains of Tyranid corpses and daubing themselves in Xenos ichor like war paint. The billions of orcs and thousands of squigosaurs under Stomper enthusiastically engaged the Tyranids, and for a time it looked like they might achieve the big kill they sought. But the Tyranids, directed by the Swarmlord's will, were playing the long game. They saw that Stomper's offensive was gradually losing momentum. Most of his pet squigosaurs had perished, and his beast snagger hunter boys found themselves countered at every turn by the ever-adapting Tyranids. Orcs were getting fewer and fewer kills, as the Tyranids shifted tactics, creating rising resentment that saw Stomp Crumper's authority challenged by ambitious underlings. The Hive Mind decided to hasten the orc implosion,
Stomp Crumper's own undoing came at the hands of a vast new biotitan that the Greenkins had never yet encountered. This monstrosity was equipped with fangs as tall as orks and claws that could tear apart a fortified hab block. Its carapace was a striking fluorescent blue, and its eyes glowed a piercing yellow. The Orks nicknamed it the Blue One. The creature became the target of every Ork big game hunter on Bad Squig, Stomper included. It seemed to show up at hotspots, obliterate some Ork war machines, then vanish back into dense terrain or underground tunnels. Stomper, obsessed with claiming this trophy, planned trap after trap against the creature, sacrificing thousands of his troops to bait it out. But all to no avail. The Blue One either avoided the traps or tore through any Orks that confronted it. The beast was luring the Orks further and further into the Hive Mind's trap. Stomper spent every waking moment hunting it, until at last he and his hordes found themselves at the center of a deep dried lake bed, far from any support, exactly where the Tyranids wanted them. Without a second thought, tactical acumen not being an Ork's strength, Stomprumper bellowed and launched an all-out attack when the Blue One finally appeared in the lake bed. The Orks charged en masse, and the Tyranids sprung their ambush. Biomeans buried under the cracked mud detonated, collapsing the Ork advance into confusion. And then from all sides, the Tyranids swarmed in vast numbers. Orks fought and died surrounded with Stomp Crumper himself at the heart of the brawl. When the dust settled, the war boss and his best were no more, wiped out in an overwhelming encirclement. DL1 had vanished again, its role as bait fulfilled. Bad Squig's big kill was over, and the Ork resistance on that world crumbled soon after. With the peripheral worlds neutralized and major Ork war bosses like Stomp Crumper eliminated, the Swarmlord turned its full attention to the heart of the Empire. Octaria, capital of the Ork Empire and seat of the Overfiend himself. Octaria had already been heavily contested earlier in the war, but now the Tyranids sought to finish it. The Swarmlord orchestrated a massive convergence of Tyranid swarms from across the sector. A multi-pronged offensive aimed squarely at breaking the Orks' back. First, the Hive Mind moved to cut off Octaria from any outside support. Not that much remained at this point. Thousands of Tyranid bioships encircled the planet in a blockade thicker than a Catacomb Devil's Hide Ork ships big and small that tried to run this gauntlet were obliterated or driven off, and the few cunning blockade runners that slipped through became trivial in the grand scheme. Meanwhile, on the surface, the Tyranid forces already planet-side were reinforced by the hour. The Swarmlord cunningly deployed vanguard creatures behind Ork lines as the Orks were preoccupied with holding their fortress walls. Burrowing Triggerers infiltrated key areas in the Ork rear. Suddenly, Ork ammo depots went up in bioplasma flames. Squiggoth pens were opened and the beasts stampeded through Ork camps and weird boy towers. Crude Ork psychic constructs were toppled before crucial battles, denying Orks some of their more esoteric firepower. Chaos reigned in the Ork defenses, with these sabotage strikes throwing the Greenkins off balance. The main Tyranid assault on Octaria began. It started in the skies. Endless waves of winged Tyranid gargoyles and flying hive tyrants swarmed the atmosphere, tangling with Ork fighter bombers and Dakar jets in dogfights that left the air thick with smoke and falling debris. The Orks loved a good air scrap, but the sheer number of bioforms eventually overwhelmed even the most daredevil Ork pilots. Tyranids achieved air superiority, which spelled doom for many Ork fortresses below, as spore pods and aerial bombers could now strike more freely. Then came the ground landings again. Meotic spores rained down by the millions, delivering fresh broods into the fight. By this time, Octaria's once thriving surface was a blasted wasteland of cratered megacities and endless battlefields. A true Ork might remark, it was a great improvement over the boring old cityscape.
The Orks had turned entire mountain ranges into fortress networks and hollowed out the crust to create enormous underground fortresses and moving factories that crawled along on tectonic rails. Because an Ork fortress that moves is obviously superior to one that stands still. The Overfiend, the big boss of Octaria, commanded from one such mobile scrap city, bristling with gargantuan cannons and teeming with millions of green warriors. As the Tyranids advanced, the Orks fought back with every insane contraption they had left. There were jaw-like trenches hundreds of miles long that literally opened and closed, swallowing whole columns of Tyranids into grinders below. There were trampolines made of power fields that bounced descending spore pods back into the sky. Only Orks would think of warfare as an opportunity for slapstick humor. Entire city blocks were rigged to shift and collapse on command, turning streets into sudden canyons or walls to herd the swarm where the Ork gunners wanted them. Massive electromagnets the size of cathedrals were activated, yanking swarms of metal-bearing Tyranids and bits of their own scrap into giant scrap compactor pits, which then ignited with cleansing fire. Picture a Tyranid carnifex suddenly stuck to a magnet, flailing as it's dragged into a furnace. That sort of delightful image was happening in droves. Yet, despite these mechanical marvels of mayhem, the Tyranids kept coming, inexhaustible and undeterred. With a bit of razzle-dazzle involving captured Genan stealers smuggled aboard a space hulk, the Tyranids were soon plunging into the heart of Octarius and beginning the all-out war. We see today, with each passing day, more and more bioships arrived at Octaria to begin the consumption process. These ships fed upon areas captured by the Tyranids, producing waves of fresh reinforcements for the Octarian meat grinder. Enormous losses and setbacks caused by the Ork machinery slowed the swarm. But the Swarmlord had ample reserves and used sheer numbers and attrition to grind away the greenskin defenses. Through all of this, the Swarmlord itself never appeared on the battlefield initially. It waited for the perfect moment to strike. Meanwhile, the Overfiend himself was becoming isolated, separated from his chief lieutenants one by one, as they were picked off in battles across the sector. Finally, the Swarmlord judged that the time was ripe to slay the greenskin ruler and break the Empire's last hope. It telepathically summoned two massive mega-swarms to converge on the Overfear's location. The first swarm was to surround the Overfear's main army and attack from all sides, while the second was to form a wider circle around the battle to prevent any escape or reinforcements. At the enormous mobile scrap city known as Mika Scrap, the stage was set for the final showdown. The Swarmlord committed hundreds of bio-titans to the attack. In the ensuing battle, the Tyranidated numbers were seemingly endless, and the Orks found themselves overwhelmed and rapidly running out of ammunition and machinery. Such was the Tyranid onslaught that normally elite bioforms like Tyrant Guards and Monlocks were expended as though they were mere gaunt. The sheer mass of Tyranid bodies clogged the treads of Ork tanks and bogged down even the mighty Ork Gargans, preventing them from maneuvering. The Overfiend himself was at the center of the fighting, killing Tyranids beyond count with sweeps of massive axes and crushing blows of his powered claw. He roared defiance as Ichor rained down around him, and piles of alien corpses rose at his feet. But in the press of countless enemies, even he found himself isolated from his entourage of elite Scarboys. The moment came when the Ovind, slaying yet another Carnifex, suffered a deep wound in his thigh from a sneaky lictor's talons. He barely shook it off, but the Swarmlord, watching from afar, sensed the time had finally come to make its move. The Hive Mind's herald strode onto the battlefield with a personal guard of hundreds of tyrant guards and frenzied Carnifexes. This force smashed into the Overfiend remaining Scarboys. The Ork elites fought with ferocity, annihilating dozens of the Tyrant Guard and Carnifexes in their fury. Massive Ork Death Dreads waited in as well, their buzzsaw arms slicing apart alien beasts. But all of this just cleared the path for the Swarmlord to engage the Overfiend himself. The Xenos command beast
allowed the greenskin warlord to expend his energy in a flurry of strikes. It kept moving and parrying, using its multiple arms and preternatural speed to its advantage. Biding its time, the Overfiend fought with unmatched ferocity, never once pausing or slowing down. He was an Ork who had lived for this ultimate duel. But as his blows kept coming, the Swarmlord began to pick him apart. First, it severed one of the power cables to the Overfiend's powered claw with a precise slash. With its hydraulics cut, the Overfiend's massive claw became a dead weight, dragging at his side, limiting his offense. The Ork let out a growl of fury and kept swinging his chain axe one-handed, but the Swarmlord had already shifted tactics. The alien general abandoned its cautious fencing and unleashed unrelenting fury with a blur of bone sabers. It went on the offensive. The Overfiend met the flurry with his axe, parrying several strikes and even scoring a glancing hit that chipped one of the Swarmlord's blades. But a follow-up strike took the Overfiend off guard. One sword smashed aside the Ork's ass. Another pierced through his thick armor and into his shoulder, while a third weapon sliced into his leg. The mighty warlord stumbled, blood gushing from multiple wounds. Even then, the Overfiend mustered a bellowing laugh, as Orks do, enjoying the fight even as it kills them, and attempted one last strike. The Swarmlord deftly sidestepped, coiling its tail around the Ork's ankle and pulling. The Overfiend fell to one knee with a crash, suddenly grappling with the reality that his body was failing him. The Swarmlord knew the victory was at hand. It lunged forward and in a gruesome finale crossed two of its bone swords and brought them down in a scissoring chop that smashed through the Overfiend's thick skull. Finally, the Swarmlord opened its slavering maw and bit down, tearing out the Overfiend's head and a good portion of his torso in a single horrific gulp. It lifted the Ork's sundered head high and devoured the brain within. The greenskin warlord was truly dead, and victory belonged to the Hive Mind. Thus died the Overfiend of Octarius, the emperor of the Ork Empire, at the hands of the Tyranid Swarm's most deadly servant. The biggest node of resistance had been severed in one stroke. Aftermath, a puristic triumph. The fall of the Overfiend was effectively the end of organized Ork resistance in Octarius. In the immediate weeks that followed the Uvian's death, the greenskin forces across the sector fragmented. Without their boss to unite them, the Orks spread outwards from Octaria, and infighting increased. No fewer than 6 different Ork warlords across various worlds declared themselves the new Overfiend and began gathering forces and predictably started fighting each other as much as the Tyranids. Instead of uniting against the Tyranids, many Ork mobs turned on one another in a free-for-all contest for dominance. The Tyranids, by contrast, capitalized on the confusion. The Swarmlord and the Hive Mind directed the swarms to mop up remaining pockets of Ork resistance systematically. One by one, the surviving Ork strongholds were isolated and overwhelmed by the now dominant Hive fleet. Some war bosses fought bitter last stands in the ruins of their fortresses. Others simply vanished under tides of Khitan and fangs, their fates unrecorded but certainly unpleasant. The Great Octarian War was not a clean instant finish. Orks are extremely hard to fully exterminate, and on some worlds, the Greenkins continued guerrilla-style scraps or persisted in feral states in deep jungles and caves, even as Tyranid harvesters scoured the surface. But strategically, it was clear the Tyranids had gained the upper hand. The Ork Empire of Octarius was smashed, yet calling it a triumph for the Tyranids might be oversimplifying. The Hive Fleet had suffered astronomical losses in the process. Countless bioforms slain, countless genetic strains tested and expended. The war had raged for years, perhaps longer than the Hive Mind originally anticipated.
and much biomass had been burned up in this hellish contest of escalation. Still, the ultimate goal of the Tyranids to consume was now within reach. As Ork worlds fell quiet, the bioships descended like gigantic ticks, sinking feeder tendrils into soil and sea to absorb every nutrient available. The once teeming Octarius sector started to go dark on Imperial charts. Its worlds reduced to lifeless husks one after another. The Imperium, for its part, could only watch with grim acceptance. Kryptman's gamble had come to its dreadful conclusion. Hive Fleet Leviathan's tendril had indeed been slowed and bloodied by the Octarius War, but in doing so, it had effectively devoured one of the largest concentrations of Orks in the galaxy and grown fat from it. Inquisitor Soon's cordon impenetra remained in effect along the borders. Those defenses probably prevented the war from spilling into a full galactic apocalypse, at least while the Xenos were preoccupied with each other. Thanks to sacrifices like the defense of Sigma Ulstery, the Tyranids and Orks were largely contained during the height of the fighting. There's no doubt that those measures saved many Imperial worlds from invasion in the short term. But as reports filtered in of the Orks' defeat, there was little cause for celebration in Imperial High Command. Now, there was the matter of a victorious Tyranid swarm, bloated with fresh biomass sitting right on the other side of the fence. Of the original architect of this scenario, Inquisitor Kryptman, little is said at this point in the story. The Inquisition had long since stripped him of rank and declared him rogue for his actions. Some whisper he continued his xenocidal work in the shadows, possibly aiding here and there with expert advice to those containing the Octarius front or setting up new traps for Tyranids elsewhere. Others say Kryptman simply vanished into self-imposed exile, burdened by the knowledge of what he had wrought. A war that had killed untold billions of humans, Orks and Tyranids alike. Perhaps in his more candid moments, he wondered if there might have been another way. Or perhaps he took grim satisfaction that by his calculus the Imperium still stood, whereas without his Octarius gambit, Leviathan might have eaten its way through much of the galaxy by now. In the ruthlessly pragmatic logic of the Imperium, even a nightmare can be a win if it's the lesser of two worst nightmares. In the Octarius sector itself, an eerie silence began to fall in places that once roared with constant battle. One by one, battlefields fell quiet. On some planets, the only sound was the crackle of small fires or the buzzing of carrion insects over carpeted plains of bones. Towering Ork garrants and fortresses lay half-sunken in the mud, gutted and overgrown with strange Tyranid spore tendrils. The skies that had been black with spore clouds and smoke for so long finally cleared to a pale, empty gray. It was an unnatural peace, the stillness that follows immense violence, fragile and haunted. Few dared venture into this graveyard sector now, and those that did would find little more than death and echoes of war. Meanwhile, the Imperials stabilized what fronts they could. The Sigma Ulstery line was secured, and battered regiments from dozens of chapters and worlds licked their wounds. A measure of normalcy returned to some surrounding subsectors, but everyone knew that the Octarius situation was far from truly resolved. Imperial Navy patrols along the cordon reported increasing Tyranid scout activity, trying to breach containment and Ork infestations, while Shattered have a way of crawling back from even near annihilation. Spores left in the ashes can eventually sprout new feral Ork tribes, if not thoroughly purged. The Orks had been beaten, but were they truly gone? Time would tell. Conclusion. In the end, the Octarius War answered the question. What if an Ork war met the Tyranid Hive Mind? The answer was as epic as it was horrifying. They will fight. Oh, how they will fight. And they'll drag everyone and everything nearby into their apocalyptic brawl. The Octarius War became a meat grinder with no precedent. A war where the only true winners were death and destruction themselves. The Orks got the titanic battle they always dreamed of, and the Tyranids got to sate their hunger on some of the galaxy's toughest prey. But crucially, neither was eliminated, and whoever ultimately comes out on top will be more dangerous than ever. If the Orks had somehow prevailed entirely, it's frightening to imagine how powerful their empire and any subsequent war would be after absorbing the lessons and spoils of such a war. In the more likely scenario of Tyranid victory, the Hive Fleet will emerge engorged on Ork biomass and battlefield evolution, a nightmare made stronger by the very act of winning. In short, neither side's triumph would spell relief for the galaxy. It would only herald a new phase of terror for humanity. Watching from the sidelines, the Octarius War was a stark lesson in unintended consequences. A desperate plan forged in the hope of weakening two enemies instead created a conflagration that nearly spiraled out of control. If there is any solace, it's that for a time two great threats occupied each other instead of feasting on mankind. But that solace is cold and fleeting like the calm before a storm. As the galaxy marches on, battered and bleeding, one can only imagine what horrors the future holds once the Tyranids finish their grim harvest at Octarius. Or if the Orks somehow rebound in its aftermath. One thing is certain. There are no easy solutions in the grim darkness of the far future. Every what-if can birth a new nightmare. Inquisitor Kryptman's gambit asked, "Why not let the monsters kill each other?" The Octarius War gave us the answer. Because sometimes the monsters only grow bigger and meaner in the killing. So if ever faced with the temptation to pit one terror against another, remember the fate of Octarius. A war of gargantuan forces that nearly consumed a sector and still threatens the galaxy at large. In Warhammer 40,000, when an unstoppable war meets an immovable hive fleet, the only guarantee is an unending supply of carnage. And in that unending carnage, there is no peace, no respite, only the promise of more.